Today we're talking about what is an array, the type of. We'll talk a little bit about something called the array class, and then some of the methods that come along with it that make our lives really easier. We'll talk about the typical things like how do we access elements in an array, as well as how do we create and add elements to an array as well. And then we're going to go over some basic methods, including the dot length property. Okay, so what is an array? Um, Colloquially, arrays are lists, right? They're basically containers for multiple pieces of information in JavaScript. We write an array with the open and close square brackets, and every array has to have an open square bracket followed at some point by a closed square bracket. Because because an array is a list, it can hold multiple things, and each of those things will be separated by a comma in between. And so here on line 3, we have an array called numbers, and inside the array we have three things: the number 1, comma 2, comma 3. On line 5, we have a variable, called names, and it's an array with three strings inside of it. And so arrays can hold as many things as we want. Basically, normally we say, oh, you can hold as many things as a computer can hold, but really computers are so massive nowadays, so you can kind of think arrays as just infinite if you need it to be, really. And they can hold as many types of things as well as many different types of things as you need to. So there on line 9 we have a number, we have a boolean, we have a string followed by a null followed by a variable value. So there's no rule that says an array has to be all of the same thing. It can be as many different things as you want. And so that's why arrays really offer you just tremendous flexibility in holding information. The proper terminology for the things inside the arrays is called an element. So I would say, for example, on line 3 there, the numbers array has 3 elements. Type of is something that we've seen before. And one of the nuances of JavaScript actually is that if I do type of and I feed it an array, arrays in Java aren't actually they're not a traditional data type in JavaScript. What arrays are just really fancy objects. However, in very kind of common use cases, we say arrays and objects are different in JavaScript. But to the JavaScript language itself, if I do type of, as in what data type is this variable, the type of an array is actually another object. And so if we're trying to figure out whether or not something is an array by just a variable, type of doesn't tell us if something is an array or not. It could be an array, but it can also be an object. So the proper way to test whether or not something is an array is with something called the array.isArray method. Once again, notice how the A in array is capitalized, right? That tells us off the bat that we're dealing with the array class. And so the array class, much like when we did our lesson on coercion, just like the number class, the string class, the boolean class, those things are all those things all pre-exist in JavaScript. And the .isArray function is just a function that comes built in. And so the way you use it is if you just call array.isArray and then as a function and you feed in whatever variable you want to test. Here we're on line 3, we're testing the names variable. On line 5, we're feeding in a string called I am not an array. We're going to get back one of two values, our old friend the boolean. Either something is an array or it's not an array. That's pretty much it. Good?
Good.
Yeah, cool. All right, so accessing elements inside an array is how you would imagine is the same way as the way we access characters inside a string. We use brackets as well as an index number corresponding to the position of the things inside the array. So here with an array of 3 things, if I want to access the first thing, remember, and this is something that maybe trips people up in the very beginning, the positions in arrays and most things in programming start at 0, not at 1. So when I do our names, I use the square bracket of index 0. That's saying get me the thing at the 0th position, which actually means in human language, get me the first thing in the array. And so here when I do names index 0, I get back George. And when I do names index 1 and 2, I get back John and Thomas. Notice how on line 13, I'm asking for the element at position number, at index number 3, which corresponds to the 4th element in the array. Well, my list or my array only has three things. There is no 4th thing. And so when you do that, what JavaScript does is JavaScript actually doesn't give you back an error. It actually gives you back an undefined. And so, just as something to keep in mind is that in the future, when you try to access an element in an array that doesn't exist, JavaScript won't like say, "Hey, I'm going to break and tell you there's an error." It would actually give you back undefined. The good news is sometimes it doesn't break, which is good for you. But also kind of keep in mind that you might also be using this variable to do something later on. And so if you're not aware of how long your array is, sometimes you get these undefined values that you try to use later on in your function, and that will break things. So just something to keep in the back of your mind. And so whereas we use the bracket notation to access or to read elements, here we can also just put equal sign, which once again is our assignment operator, and we can actually assign values directly as well. So here on line 4, I have a names array with 3 strings in it. Well, on line 6, 8, and 10, all we've really done is saying, hey, go to the thing at index 0, or the first thing, and replace that with the string Washington. Similarly, there you go. Similarly, I can do it with Jefferson as well. And now when I look at my new array, it's a brand new array with three different new things inside of it. Okay, so reading it and then replacing it are almost the same exact process, except in one of them you use an equal sign, the way we assign any other variables. Yeah, so one of the things that we talked about, and once again, this is not the exact lecture that we're going to talk about complex versus primitive data types, but just to touch on it just for a little bit here. On line 7, we have an array with 5 things, right? The string B, the string R, ace as well. And on line 8, we have an actual string called brace. We said that complex data types can be changed, primitive data types can't. And we also said that arrays are complex data types and strings are primitive data types. So actually, let's put that theory to the test then. Here on line 10, I'm going to my array and going to the first element, the first item, and saying, hey, you are now the character G. On line 11, we do the same exact thing. We're going to the string and we're saying, hey, your first character is now G. Once we make that change, when we console log out array as well as string, we notice that the array was changed. The first letter went from a B to a G, right? So now it says Grace. But when we look at our string variable, well, we told you before, you cannot change strings, and lo and behold, the first letter in the string did not change. It stayed a B. So it's more of like a kind of proving that like this is kind of one of the reasons why arrays are complex, or we say they're complex or they're mutable, right? Which is that, hey, I can add things to arrays, I can take things away from arrays, I can also replace things in arrays. All in all that really means all that really means is just that, hey, look, like if I give you an array, I can actually change the values later on before you use it. If I give you a string, it's going to be that string no matter what. Okay. Any questions so far before we move on to the properties and the methods of arrays?
Nope.
Really quickly.
Yep.
If we change, or you did string index 0 is Grace, would that change Grace to Grace or no?
If I do string index 0 equal to Grace?
Yeah, would that change Brace to Grace?
Nope. I can't change an array, period. I can't change a single letter. I can't change all the letters. The only thing I can do, and we'll cover this next week, is we can actually reassign the variables string to a different value. But I can't change like a part.
Okay, I think that's what I was thinking of. Thanks.
Yeah. Cool. So all arrays have something built in, much like because all arrays are made from the array class. So they all have a property that's built into it. It's called the .length property. And it works the way that you imagine it would. Like, and if you've seen it with strings, it works the same exact way. If I just do names and then names.length, that will just tell you how many items are in my array, how many elements are in my array. Names.length, the .length property will always return a number. And if you have an empty array, it will simply return 0. Okay. So one of the things to know with .length, because of the property, is that it's like a kind of a static piece of information, and that you don't have to call anything, and that's why we call it property. And that's to distinguish it from the next like 5 or 6 things we're going to talk about, which are called methods. And they're called methods because they're actually functions, right? As in we call them, but then we usually need to use the open and close parentheses to invoke them. And usually speaking, those functions require something that we're feeding into it. So all of the array methods we're going to be talking about today are just have to concern us that they all involve adding or removing things from arrays. Today we're talking about the very basic ones. On next Monday we're talking about some more complex ones too. So if you have some functionalities you want to do with arrays, but you haven't seen them today, just hold tight. You might see them tomorrow or the next class. So the first one is very simple. It's called a dot push function. All it does is it takes one or more elements and adds them to the end of the array. It also returns the new length of the array, and I'll talk about that in just a second. So here on line 4, I have the names array. If I do on line 6, or if I do names.push and I feed in the string James, and I console log out names, now my array has 4 things: George, John, Thomas, and then the thing that I fed in gets pushed at the very end. So now it says George, John, Thomas, James. Okay, that's what the array. That's what the method does. One of the things that people always get confused about with array methods is there's a difference between what the method does and what it returns. Okay, imagine your boss asks you to compile a report, right? The work that you do might require research, Googling, writing, all this stuff. The thing that you give to him or her at the end of the day could just be a piece of paper, right? Same thing here. What the method does is it takes the element, it takes a piece of information, or it takes a data point and adds it to the end of the array. What the function returns then is the new length of the array. And that's why on line 6, all we're saying there is we're creating a variable called new length, and we're capturing the output of whatever names.push returns. And when I console log out new length, I get 4, because there are now 4 things in the array. If I don't care about the new length of the array, I just care about adding stuff, I don't need to create a variable to store that return value. But if I do care about the return value, then I need to create a variable to store it. Yeah, that's pretty much it for push, right? So the key takeaways here is we're adding things to the end of the array, and it will give you back the new length of the array. If I want to remove something from the end of the array, then so the converse of the dot push function, or the dot push method, it's a dot pop method. What it does is if I call it on an array, I don't need to feed anything in because I'm always returning the last thing, and obviously I'm always removing the last thing. And to remove something, I don't need to give it any new information. If I just call names.pop, what it will do is it will remove an element. So what it does is it removes the last element of the array, but what it returns is the element that just got removed. And so here on line 6, I create a variable called Jefferson, and I use it to store whatever names.pop returns. Now when I call the names array, I see that Thomas got removed from the end of it, and when I console log out the Jefferson variable, I see that it now equals Thomas, which was the thing that was removed. Okay, so dot push adds things to the end of the array. Dot pop removes one thing from the end of the array. The next one is dot shift, which works just like dot pop in that it removes the one element from the array, except here dot shift just removes it from the beginning of the array instead of the end. It's called shift because, as you can imagine, if there's like every index shifts. Think of it as if you're in a line of 10 people and your numbers and the first person goes in and gets served. Well, now everyone else's position kind of shifts up one, right? Same exact idea. I don't think it's actually particularly creative, but hey, whatever. And so here on line 6, we have a names array again. If I just do names.shift and I store the output in this variable called Washington, I look at names, I look at Washington. Well, the names array now is going to be John Thomas because the first element got removed, the George got removed. And when I looked at the Washington variable, we'll see the element George, which was the element that was removed. And so if we're keeping track, push adds to the end of the array, pop removes from the end of the array, shifts removes from the beginning of the array. So as you can imagine, the last thing we have, and probably the worst named function that we're going to see today, the unshift method, which adds one or more things to the beginning of the array. Names is we have our array names, and here all we're doing is doing names.unshift, same as .push. We now feed in the thing that we want to add at the beginning of the array, and when I look at the new array after I unshift something, I see that the King George III in this case got shifted to the beginning of the array, and the new length of the array is now also 4. Okay, so all we're doing so far in these 4 methods is we're giving you tools for you to add or remove things from the end of the array. If I want to remove multiple things from the array, you'll learn another method next week. But for today, just keep popping or keep shifting, right? That will do the trick. Another method. So those are the ones that we use to edit the array. We have a couple more ones that I want to show you to just kind of get more information about the array. Dot index of is essentially a search function or a search method. If I call the array, I call dot index of, and I feed in a given value, it will actually look for that value in the array. A few caveats to know. It has to find the exact match, right? So here, if the array has the string George, John, Thomas, and I look for just GEO, I'm not going to find any matches. The match has to be, the entire element has to match my search query exactly. Okay, so a partial search does not work here. The other thing to note is that it also searches from the left going right. Right? It starts from the first element and goes down the list. And so if I have multiple matches, it will only look at the first one that it finds going from left to right. And what does it return? It returns back the index or the position of the match. Right? So if I see any number that's 0 or greater, then it means it found a match, right? And that number gives me the position of where the element is. However, if I was not able to find a match, or if there are no matches in the array, then this function gives you back a -1. Okay, so whenever you see a -1, it means there was no match. Whenever you see any other number, it means, hey, we found a match. All of these slides, like you said, I think walked together how to find them last class. But for now, when you do the workshop, you should have these slides pulled up. I know I'm throwing a lot at you really quickly, but I almost feel like looking at them in slides. Make sure you understand them. Don't worry about memorizing them, because when you do the workshops, you're going to want to have these slides up as a reference regardless, right? Memorizing these is actually really hard. I think you probably will memorize it by just using them quite a bit. Okay, the last one we're going to talk about today is the dot slice method. Dot slice is it works just like the one. The string class also has a dot slice method. It works the same way. Essentially, it's a copy method. It's a way for you to copy parts or the entire array. Slice takes in 2 arguments, okay, 2 pieces of information. The first thing it takes is inclusively, where do you want to start copying? So in this case here on line 6, notice how on the right hand side I call names.slice. My first argument is a 1, which means I want to start at index 1 and include index 1. And the second number I give it tells me where I want it to stop before it gets to that element. So it's exclusive. And so here, names.slice 1, 2 means start at index 1, include index 1, but stop before you get to index 2. So when I look at the names array on line 4 there, if I start at index 1, that's John, and it's inclusive of John, so I'm copying at least John. Stop before I get to index 2. Well, index 2 is Thomas. So basically, I start at John and I stop before I get to Thomas. So essentially, all I'm doing is creating a copy of an array with just the element John. And indeed, and this is also very key, you're making a copy, right? You're not modifying the original array. And so because of that, you always want to store whatever value is returned in a new variable. Here, we're storing it in the variable 1-term precedence. So on line 8, when I console log out 1-term precedence, I see an array with just the string John. And then if I console log out the original array, I see that it's unchanged. A few other tidbits about the slice method too. If you want to make a copy of the entire thing, JavaScript saves you the trouble of having to define where it starts and where it ends. If you just do names.slice and don't give it any arguments, by default, that means it will copy the entire array. And so here on line 6, we create a copied array called names copy, and we just do names.slice, so we just made a copy of names. On line 8, notice how we're changing the third element, i.e. the element index 2 for the names copy array to Paul. We then push Ringo onto the end of the copied array. And then when I look at the names as well as the names copy, I see that the original names array is, as you can imagine, completely unchanged. But now my names copy array was modified. We replaced one value and added another value. The last thing I'll say is that if you call the dot slice method with only a single number, then that's a shortcut or a shorthand way of copying everything from that index all the way to the very end. Okay, so no argument means copy the entire thing. One argument means start here and stop at the very end. And then 2 arguments means start at the first argument, stop before we get to the second argument. Okay, and you're creating a brand new array. And if you want to create if you and so just be cognizant that that slice will always give you back an array. Oh,
Quick question about dot slice.
Yeah.
If I wanted to copy the first index in an array, would I use -1?
That could work. Actually, I don't need any check that. I know it works in Python. I don't know if it actually works in JavaScript. But you also just do slice 0, 1. That also works just as well. Yeah. You can try it out. I mean, it's a really quick tryout. I just don't want to tell you the wrong thing. Yeah.
Check it out.
Yep. Sorry. There's a few more here. Dot includes. It works just like the dot index of function, except it's a little bit more coarse in the sense that dot index of tells you if we find a match where it is, right? What position it's in. Dot includes doesn't go that far. It just says it will give you back either true or false. Yes, there's a match, or no, there's no match. So not groundbreaking, right? It just gives you back a Boolean value. And then the last one is dot reverse method, which changes the original array and just takes the original array. You can call dot reverse on it, and you look at it now. The first element becomes the last element. The last element becomes the first element, and you work your way down, right? So George, John, Thomas becomes Thomas, George, Thomas, John, and George. Pretty, hopefully a pretty straightforward and explanatory function. And that's it for today. Okay, so we covered a lot of bits of material, but hopefully nothing here were things that like kind of caught you off guard. Most of them should have been touched upon at least a little bit in the pre-work, but I'm also happy to take any questions you have. Yeah. So any questions before we get started?
Yeah, I had one quick question.
Go ahead.
You didn't cover anything on using the array constructor. Can we use that in the workshop?
When would you want to use an array constructor?
Let's say that you wanted to create a new array and you simply wanted to call the new array constructor, say new array, and just create an empty array.
Yeah, absolutely. Is that any different than what we're doing on line 3 here? If I just
but if you want to create an empty one, it would just be just 2 brackets. So is there really any difference between the two? And which one is more efficient?
The efficient question, I can't tell you. My intuition would say that it's probably the same. I would imagine that if I do what I do here on line 3 and I just straight up just like let numbers equal an empty array, that also creates an empty array. And I want to believe that it probably dovetails, or it not dovetails, it converges with the same process that JavaScript uses whenever you use the array constructor. But in my experience, there's really like for the kind of built-in JavaScript data types like objects or arrays or anything like that, there's really no advantages to using a constructor versus just kind of the syntax out of box. Usually people use constructors when they're dealing with custom constructors that they've created, and usually that's because when you initiate a new instance, you're feeding a bunch of custom information. With arrays, with objects, I'm sure you could do it that way, but it almost feels like it's maybe more work than is necessary.
Yeah. So you thought that wouldn't be best practice to call the constructor method?
So I'm trying to think of what are the instances in which I would call a constructor for an array. I guess one thing. Well, I mean, I guess if I have a function, if I'm programmatically trying to generate a bunch of arrays and I have a bunch of things, I could just feed. Basically, if I'm trying to dynamically create arrays, I could use a constructor in a loop to just generate a bunch of arrays. But even then, like using like ... probably works just as well, because I would be feeding in like the argument or feeding in an array as a list of arguments into the object. So on top of my head, I would say that for this bootcamp, there's definitely no advantages that I know of to using a constructor versus just this kind of shorthand syntax. And there may be one in reality, but not one that comes to mind very easily. Like constructors are really useful when you're dealing with custom classes that you've made, right? So if you make like a car class and you're saying, hey, whenever I create a new car, I want 5 numbers. The first number is the number of wheels, second number is the number of seats, etc., etc. That's what I mean. That's really helpful, right? That's the only way you can create a new car instance, really. With arrays, like JavaScript allows you to do this, so you kind of don't have to go through the whole constructor, like let members equal new array, parentheses, and then feed in the things. You just kind of write it as a shorthand.
Okay.
Yeah. But on the other hand, if you want to use a constructor, like, I'm not going to stop you. I think, I guess I just don't see that as common kind of in the wild. But, I'm sure there might be some edge use cases for that. Yeah, I guess the other scenario would be if you the other scenario for that could